Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today I have a very special guest. His name is Jon Meyer. I actually found out about him through my counselor, and he said that this Jon Meyer, he is a part of this organization called Ratio Christi, and he used to be a professor of philosophy, and I was like, wow, that seems very interesting. I'd never heard of Ratio Christi, and, well, do you mind explaining what you do and how you came to be a director or a chapter leader at Ratio Christi?
Yeah, well, it was actually an interesting journey. So, first of all, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the invite.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it started back when I was in graduate school, and as you said, I've been into philosophy for a while, and I'm still a professor of philosophy. I'm an adjunct both now at Eastern Kentucky University and the University of Kentucky, so I teach both places. I've got 2 classes at each this current semester. So it was an interesting journey. After even getting to grad school in the first place was sort of an interesting journey. But while I was in grad school, actually this was just after grad school, one of my former professors, who's, I don't know, he's off again, on again, the head of the department there at Western, in the philosophy department, Tim McGrew. And he...
Oh, I know him, actually. Huh.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So he pointed me toward, he gave me this pamphlet that said, Apologists Wanted. And I was like, oh, Apologists Wanted. Okay, so this is, looking for people who are defending the faith, defending Christianity. And I said, well, that sounds like I was already kind of doing something like that at Western, but it really wasn't going anywhere. So I thought, I'll check this place out, and went through the very lengthy onboarding process. They have the application, by the time you get done with it, it was 30 pages long or something like that. They really want to grill you on a bunch of different issues in theology and those sorts of things. But I did that, and then I came on board there at Western Michigan University as the assistant director. At the same time, another guy had applied for the same position, and he got the director position. And so he and I basically partnered, started the chapter there at Western Michigan University. Neither one of us are there anymore. I moved down to Kentucky, and he ended up having some health issues, and so he had to back out as well. So I'm not actually sure how the chapter is doing there. I'm not sure if it's still going or not. It may be. But I haven't checked in with those guys in a bit. But we started the chapter there, and we had some very interesting times there. Maybe it would be helpful if I kind of explain what it is that we do.
Yeah.
So, Ratio Christi is a group. They are a student group, a Christian student group, like Crew or InterVarsity or anything like that. But we focus on apologetics. That is, we focus on using evidence from science, from history, from philosophy, those sorts of things, in order to show that Christianity is true, in order to show that the Bible is historically reliable, in order to show that there are good reasons for believing in the existence of God, those sorts of things. And we meet on a regular basis. Typically, our chapters meet every week. Depending on the school, though, that's going to be a little bit different. There are chapters on over 150 colleges throughout the United States and now even internationally. I think there's one in the Philippines, one in, I want to say there's one in South Africa as well. So now going international. But we meet every week to talk about these intellectual issues in Christianity. That's the main thing. And to answer people's tough questions about Christianity. And so Ratio Christi, which is Latin for the reason of or the reason for Christ, is basically giving reasons for Christianity and living out what Peter said in 1 Peter 3:15 when he said that we always need to have a reason for the hope that is within us. And that word reason is the word apologia, which is where we get the word apologetics. And it just means a well-reasoned defense. In fact, in Greek, that's what they called the defense case in a court of law, was the apologia, or the apology. So if you read Plato's Apology, it's Socrates defending himself in court. So that's what the apology is, the apologia. It's the defense in a court of law. So Peter is calling us to make a well-reasoned defense of Christianity as if we were defending it, as if we were the lawyer defending it in a court of law. And so that's what we try to do on a weekly basis in this group, is to give college students good reasons for believing in Christianity. So it's a really great ministry, and I'm glad to be part of it. So I started there at Western Michigan University. Then I got married, and my wife lived down in Lexington, Kentucky. So I moved down here, and there was a guy who was already started a chapter here, but he said he was unable to do it anymore. So he actually became the assistant director, and I became the director at the University of Kentucky, and I've been there since 2018 doing that. So, and it's great.
That's a really awesome story. A college student myself, I also went to a Kalamazoo Christian high school. Like I went to and middle school and elementary school and preschool. So like I was, engaged in the Christian message from a young age. And well, I feel like I noticed there was a lot of people, specifically guys my age, who were like, I'm done with this. I'm walking away from the Christianity. Yep. Like it's, people just kind of rejecting it. Yep. It's not for me. And I was one of those people. And I was like, like, I just was like, it just doesn't make actual sense. Like people, it might feel good to say things, but like, what are you actually saying? And, luckily enough, I live with a pastor's son. I don't know if you've heard of Jeff Winky, but his son, Nate Winky, I live with. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Small world. He's of the bridge. And
yes. One of the assistant pastors there, is basically, actually, I think he's technically the youth pastor, Jeff Fernandez.
Oh, yeah, I know him.
He was the head pastor of a very tiny church that I used to go to. It was called Live Life Church, and it was like 15 people when it was done, and we just couldn't sustain it, so they closed the doors, and he actually ended up going over to the bridge. So, yeah, I know the Jeffs. I don't know Jeff all that well, but yeah, I definitely know of him, and I've met him before. So sure. You are roommates with his son?
With his son, exactly. And I guess his son, Nate, he's like right over there. He has a podcast as well, but he started down this Jordan Peterson train and some of the biblical lectures that he did, and Peterson's giving a psychological account. Like he's a psychologist, he's not claiming to be a pastor in any sense, but he makes a case for Christianity from a psychological lens. And it like opened up my eyes to the beauty of looking into the Bible more. And he showed me Carl Jung and a few other philosophers. And I was just like, it like sparked my creativity. And But then I started to notice, like, in youth group or in different organizations from the church, if I were to start asking people, like, so what does it mean to believe? Like, why are you believing? You know, what does it mean to have a good relationship with God? Or what does it mean to believe Jesus died for you? And maybe these are questions that not everyone really needs to wrestle with, but, like, I was a person who's like, I need to wrestle with it. And I'm a person who's like, well, Jacob wrestled with God and turned into the name Israel, you know, Israel, those who wrestle with God. And, like, I don't know, that verse alone or that story alone just really, like, grips me. And I've noticed that the more I wrestle, the more I search, the more I learn, and almost like you said, like, the better defense I have, and probably a better evangelist I could be. And so, but it can be isolating for, at least from my stance. And seeing this Ratio Christi, this apologetic and evangelism, you know, tied in with philosophy and science and history, like, I just, you know, this is all new to me, but it's really sparking my interest. Like, I have a question of, like, did you grow up in a Christian home? And, like, what's your trajectory? Like, I'm kind of curious, what were your rationales for believing in Jesus or in Christianity or living the life you live?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, going off of what you were just saying, there does seem to be, there's a guy by the name of Tom Gilson, who's an apologist he lives in Ohio somewhere, but he used to do this thing he called the lonely apologist. And it was basically that, it's essentially this idea that apologetics, the defense of the faith, is something that everybody needs and everybody really wants, but nobody really cares about. It's one of those things where everybody wants answers to these questions, but nobody thinks that they need apologetics. They think apologetics is just yelling at people and screaming that they're going to hell or something like that, or, you know, trying to one-up people or, you know, something like that. That's not what it's about. There might be some people who take that approach, but that's not a very good approach. It's not very convincing anyway. And trying to, you know, take a giant Bible and beat people over the head with, it's not a good way to bring people into the kingdom. But, you know, you asked this question. You said, you put forward this thought of, why is it that you believe what you believe, right? And it's interesting because the guy by the name of J. Warner Wallace, he's a former homicide detective. He was an atheist, and he decided to investigate Christianity. And he started asking questions about it, and especially the Gospel of Mark. And he came to the conclusion, using the tools that he uses as a cold case homicide detective, that Mark was in fact eyewitness testimony. That sort of led him down a road toward Christianity. Well, one of the things that he says is he asks a number of people, why are you a Christian? And let's see if I can remember this off the top of my head, but essentially there are 3 or 4 answers. And one of them is because I was raised that way. Another one was because I had some experience that led me to believe that it's true. Another one is a changed life. So I used to be in the back alley shooting up heroin, but now I'm clean because God got a hold of me, that sort of thing. Another one is I've read the Bible and it really spoke to me, and so that's why I'm a Christian. Now, one of the issues is that there can be problems with a lot of the... So, for instance, a Muslim could say the same thing about the Quran, right? They could say, I read the Quran, and this is what they do say. No one could write something so beautiful as the Quran except Allah. And so they read the Quran and they believe. Well, I say, I read the Bible and I believe. Well, you read your book, I read my book, and we both believe our own things. Well, who's actually right? It's a good question. I say all of that to come back to the original. That was a really roundabout way of coming back to the question that you asked me. My story was one of growing up in the church. I was saved at the age of 9, I believe, in Sunday school, with a little felt graph, like flannel graph. There was a little illustration of a suitcase of sin that wouldn't fit up this narrow road. It would only fit up the wide road to hell. And so I was like, well, I don't want that. And they said, well, Jesus can take away your suitcase of sin. I was like, well, I want that. So I was saved at age 9 in that Sunday school class. But in high school, actually all growing up, I had some friends that lived down the street from me, 2 brothers. I used to hang out with them on a regular basis. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. And I came to understand that they had some strange beliefs. They didn't celebrate their own birthdays. They didn't celebrate Christmas. They didn't even believe that Jesus died on a cross. He died on a pole instead, or on a tree, or just an upright beam. So I was like, why do they have such strange beliefs? And then it hit me. I was like, it's because they go to their Kingdom Hall, which is essentially their church. They go to their Kingdom Hall 3 times a week, and they're taught this is what's true. I said, that's why they believe it, because they've been told 3 times a week ever since they're 2 weeks old. They've been going to Kingdom Hall and being told this is what the truth is. Then I made a pretty big realization that that's the same thing I've done. I grew up in the church. I've been told by Sunday school people, pastors, Wednesday night group teachers, my parents, that this is what's true. And I said, how do I know that it's not me that's wrong? Maybe they're the ones that are right, and I'm the one that's wrong. How do I know? So that started a journey, asking questions. And I remember I went thinking that if the Bible is true, it should stand up to scrutiny. And if the Bible has stood up to scrutiny for over 2,000 years, then maybe it's true. Or that at least gives a lot more credibility to it if no one's been able to prove it wrong. So I told my pastor about this. I went to my pastor. And I've heard some horror stories about people in that vulnerable position going to their pastor, and their pastor saying, you need to believe. Do you believe in Jesus? You need to trust Jesus. You need to follow him. And they're like, I mean, what reason do I have? And then they just walk away because no one is giving them any reasons. My pastor wasn't a trained apologist. He wasn't someone who was hardcore into this sort of stuff. But I told him, I said, I feel like I have to follow the truth wherever it leads, even if that means finding out that God doesn't exist and the Bible is false. And my pastor, in his wisdom, said, you're right, you do. Now, some people, I mean, obviously that is a dangerous type of thing for a pastor to say to a high school student. You need to follow the truth wherever it leads, because it may lead somewhere that they don't want it to go. Parents have the same thing. Okay, but this pastor, I bugged him so much throughout high school, but more so on during undergrad. I went to Grand Valley State University, and Grand Valley State University was about 15 minutes from my parents' house. So I just lived at home during undergrad, saved some money. And the church was on the way home. So I would stop by there sometimes twice a week and just sit in the office with with Pastor Robert and say, I got some questions. And he'd say, you know what? I don't know what the answer is, but this commentary will probably help you. Or maybe this book will help you. And he told me, you know what? Even if I'm not here, if you want to come in and go into my office and sit in my office and look up something in one of my books, he said, you go right ahead. I really think that saved my spiritual life because I had questions. And even though he didn't have all the answers himself, he was willing to help this young college student deal with these things, these questions. And to some extent, I've never stopped doing that. I've never stopped asking those questions. There's still some questions that bother me, right? But I have found answers. And these answers have been so satisfying in some cases. And are just like, wow, I never knew that there was such evidence out there. And so my journey went through a lot of those discussions. And then in grad school, I met Tim McGrew. And he was, at that time, just started getting interested in what he would call historical apologetics. And so he was raiding Google Books for all kinds of stuff from the 1700s and 1800s, historical arguments for Christianity. When I mean historical arguments, I don't mean from the realm of history. Some of them were from history. But arguments that are from old, we might say, and sort of bringing them to the forefront. And some of these guys had really good arguments. So it's sort of been a life journey. It's more of a way of life rather than just a phase I went through. It became a way of life of asking questions and finding answers. And I can say at this point that I am far more convinced of the truth of Christianity than I ever would have been if somebody would have just said, you need to believe the Bible. Stop doubting and trust Jesus. Okay, if somebody would have said that, I would have been, I don't know. I don't know if I can do that. Some people maybe can. And some people can go their whole lives sometimes without having any questions. But the thing is, people have doubts. People have questions. And people want answers. And a lot of times when they don't get them, they just leave the church. And it's sad. Because it's preventable. I mean, hundreds. The statistics are somewhere in the order of 66 to 75 to 80% of church-going college students leave during college. Now, not all of them stop going, or not all of them stop believing. Not all of them stop calling themselves Christians, but a good portion of them do. A lot of people lose faith during college. It can be a rough time. And I think part of the reason is, as one apologist, Frank Turek, says, of course they're being talked out of it. They were never talked into it.
Yeah, that's really well said. And, well, I was gonna... Well, there's two ways we could go down. First off, I want to know maybe an example or two of those reasonings or evidence that was so satisfying to you that kind of like rested that doubt. It might take a minute for you to wrestle through or talk about, but I'm just curious because I'm the person who maybe could use, and maybe some people could really benefit from hearing maybe one or two examples of this, these reasonings that like you heard them and it's like, wow, this feels right. Wow, I actually have peace, and that's probably pretty rare. But the other thing I wanted to mention, which you brought up, is also like the declining rates of churchgoers. But we can dive into that later. I'm curious
Sure.
about your, yeah.
Well, one of the first things I did back in high school, and this might date me a little bit, but this was prior to Google, so I went on like Webcrawler or Dogpile or Hotbot or something like that, whatever, one of those other search engines. And I looked up Bible problems. And I got a website that was 50 pages of Bible problems. I printed it all off on the old dot matrix printer, folded it all up like an accordion with the old dot matrix printer paper, and I just started going through it. And I said, one by one, I started checking because like I'd said, I want to know if the Bible can stand up to scrutiny. If it can, then maybe there's something to it. So here's 50 pages of Bible problems. Now, most of
And when
them...
you say Bible problems, what does that mean?
Well, just it could be apparent contradictions. It could be some sort of... most of them were apparent contradictions or something. Some of them were like, Noah got drunk. Well, that's not a Bible problem. That's a Noah problem. If Noah has a drinking problem, that's on him. The Bible is just recording historically what happened. So there's actually a lot of people who have an issue between what's prescriptive and what's descriptive in the Bible. Not everything that happens in the Bible is what you're supposed to do. Okay? If people come to your door and they want to violate your guests, and you say, here, violate my daughter instead, that's not a good idea. That's not the right thing to do. That's recorded in the Bible. That's what someone did. That's not what you should do. So there's a difference between the things that the Bible says you should do and the things that it records that people have done. So not everything in the Bible is something you're supposed to do. But one of the ones that got me early on, I'll give two examples that I had early on. One was in Genesis, just before the flood. God is talking about his considerations for flooding the earth. And it says that God was, how does it put? It said that God was, God regretted creating man. And I'm thinking, now wait a second. God has foreknowledge. God knows all things. He knew this was coming. He did it anyway. He regretted creating man. So I looked it up in one of my pastor's commentaries. And the commentary said that the actual Hebrew word there means repented. So God repented of creating man. And then I'm like, that's even worse. That's even worse. So then I have to ask the question, what is the word? What's the meaning of this word? And really, when we think of repent, we think of repenting of sin. It's a turning away, but it's a movement. It's a movement of great emotion. And essentially, what that passage is saying in the Hebrew, in the context of the original language there, is that God was very moved, that God was very upset at what he had to do. He was very sad and just upset at what had to happen. So it wasn't that he regretted creating man. It wasn't that he was repenting as if he had made a mistake. It was that he was very upset and very sad that this is something that had to happen. Another one that got me was from the New Testament. So Jesus is having a conversation with his brothers and understanding where his brothers were coming from. His brothers thought he was a religious nut, and your brothers think you're a religious nut. They know that the Jews in power are looking to find Jesus, perhaps to arrest him, perhaps to kill him. He knows this, okay? But what happens in this passage, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but if you read the passage, essentially what it says is his brothers say, "Hey, Jesus, you going down to Jerusalem, going down to the festival?" And he says, "No, my time has not yet come." And then he goes anyway. Now, wait a second. My list of Bible problems says Jesus lied. We back this up. We say, his brothers say, "You should go down to the festival." Jesus says, "Nope, not going to the festival." And then Jesus goes to the festival. And then we're like, what's the deal with that, Jesus? Well, here's the idea. His brothers realize, brothers see him as a religious nut. Okay? They all know, everybody knows that the Jews are looking to arrest him. So they say, are you going down to the festival? Well, he says, "No, I'm not going down." He says, "My time has not yet come." Now, that does not mean I'm not going. What he's referring to there is my time to die has not yet come. So what he does is he doesn't go with all the other people who are heading down to the festival. He waits a couple days till the festival's already going, and then he goes down to sort of get past the people who are looking for him. They say, "Well, I guess he wasn't coming." But then he shows up down at the festival. So it's not that Jesus lied. When he says, "My time has not yet come," he's not referring to going to the festival. He's referring to dying. And so it's not actually a lie there at all. It's Jesus sort of already predicting what's going to happen to him, that he's going to die, but he's saying, right now it's not that time. So there's a number of things like that, right? And a lot of times when you look into the context, these things sort of fade away. A lot of things in the Old Testament that look real bad. There are some things that look real bad. They end up not being so when you get into the context. Okay? So, all these things about, I guess, is one that's really appalling is apparently a woman has to marry her rapist. If she is raped by someone, that she has to marry them. That seems to be what the text is saying at a surface reading, but understanding the culture, understanding the context, that's not what that's saying. In that culture, essentially there were 3 ways, well, I should say 4. There are 4 ways that a woman could be taken care of. 1, she could be taken care of by her dad. 2, she could be taken care of by her husband. 3, she could be dedicated to service at the temple. Or 4, she could be a prostitute. Those were her ways of being taken care of. In that culture, if she's raped, that significantly lowers her chances of being able to get married. In fact, it's almost 0, right? So there's going to be some major issues there. So what this text is actually saying is that it's actually not that the woman has to marry the man. It's that the man has to marry the woman if she so chooses. So if she, and it's with the caveat that he can never divorce her. He can never say bye. Essentially, if he does that to her, he has to take care of her for the rest of her life, or the rest of his life, whatever happens first. Or she can pay, or the guy can pay her dad to take care of her. That's essentially what's going on. So that passage has nothing to do with forcing the woman to marry. It has everything to do with making sure that the woman who has already had this great injustice happen to her is now going to be taken care of and not have further injustice happen to her. So these sorts of things abound, right? And it's kind of upsetting when you see people just take a surface reading of the Old Testament and say, that's just the way it is. A good book for this is a book called Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. Is God a Moral Monster? So it's good stuff. You know what? I forgot the original question that you'd asked me. What it was just to give some examples, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, were you you might have been struggling with the trying to determine whether the Bible should be trusted or not, or the authority of the Bible, or just the amount of contradictions in the Bible, or does the Bible have a lot of nonsense in it or not? Like, those were kind of the questions you were sorting through.
Sure. Primarily, I was looking at contradictions, or apparent contradictions. So that was the big thing for me. But later on, that evolved into a whole bunch of stuff like questions about the reliability of the transmission of the biblical text. Like, is the New Testament that we have today when we open our Bible anything like what was written in the second half of the first century? It does seem so, but those are questions that people have. A lot of people think it's like the telephone game. It's not like the telephone game. In fact, there's a lot of people who think that our English translation that we have, let's say like the NIV or something like that, is a translation of some earlier translation, which is a translation of some earlier translation, and on and on and on. And that every time we translate, I don't know how they would think it would go from like Greek to Latin to German to English or something like that, but that's not the case. In fact, all of the modern translations that we have are directly from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So the question is the Greek that we have essentially the Greek of the original authors? And we can go into that if you want to, but essentially the answer is almost completely. Like 99.5%, we can say with certainty is like what was there in the original. And other stuff, the other 0.5%, most of it doesn't matter. It's like names that weren't spelled the same, like John with 2 N's instead of 1, or, something like that. And things that don't really matter in Greek. So like, in English, word order matters. If I say the cat sat on the mat, that's different from the mat sat on the cat. In Greek, word order doesn't matter because the actual end of the word determines what is the subject and what is the object of the sentence. And so you can have that anywhere in the sentence, and that's still going to be the subject or the object of the sentence. So you can have Greek words that are completely flipped within a sentence in Greek, and it will have the exact same English translation. One of the things that we don't know is, I think it's a passage in Matthew chapter 2. We do not know if the original said King Herod or Herod the king. But are you going to lose sleep over that? Not really. It means the same thing. So those are sorts of things that people can get into. Also, stuff about the historical reliability of the Gospels. how the canon of the Bible was put together, that meaning why are these books in the Bible and not others? So it's a common question that people have too. So all of that stuff is all interesting stuff to talk about. We could talk about all of it if you wanted to. We'd probably be here for days, but
yeah, that gave a pretty solid overview of at least your journey of wrestling with some of these things.
Yeah.
And I was curious, like, when you're teaching these college students as a professor, what are the typical lessons or arguments or, maybe books that you're bringing up to like what are, like, let's say I'm a first time student, like, what would I expect? What would someone expect when they walk into something like Ratio Christi at their university?
It's going to be different for every chapter. So there'll be times when I'll focus on the historical reliability of the text. There's discussions of arguments for the existence of God. There's this week we're talking about the like science and faith, and what is the view of the connection between science and faith, or the connection between science and reason, or faith and reason, and those sorts of questions. It can stem from anything like having discussions about same-sex marriage and abortion, sort of hot-button issues, to things like how do we know the Bible's true? So it can range all over the place. And so it's going to depend. And it's going to depend on the chapter director, and it's going to depend on the types of things the students want to talk about. So we had an entire semester on sexual ethics. We had a whole semester where we looked at a bunch of different, I guess we'll say, flavors of Christianity. We had a Lutheran pastor come in. We had a Baptist pastor. We had a Methodist pastor, or a Methodist professor come in. We went to visit a Greek Orthodox, or actually it was Antiochian Orthodox church. And we had a Catholic priest come and, just talked about all those different things. By the way, Ratio Christi is, I would say, interdenominational. I wouldn't say it's non-denominational, because a lot of times non-denominational places are going to be like, well, let's not talk about, say, once saved, always saved. Let's not talk about that, because that's Reformed theology, and we don't want to talk about Reformed theology. We're non-denominational or whatever. We'll say, hey, let's talk about Calvinism. Let's talk about Arminianism. Let's talk about Molinism. Let's talk about all those isms and let you make up your mind for yourself. So there's a huge range of different things that could be talked about, and sort of the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, that's really, really awesome to hear. Like, I actually just went to Tim McGrew. He was hosting an event, and it was kind of along similar lines, but it was like, what was it? I don't know the exact title, but it was like something along the lines of like, can truth be found in the Bible, or like, can knowledge be found in and out of the Bible, or something about like, where can knowledge be found in and out of the Bible, or something along those lines. But it was similar to this whole idea of like, what is knowledge? What to trust? Why would you trust it? And, using science, rationality, religion, all of these things to combine. And I really like what you said a little bit ago, where you were like, let's try to talk about all the different isms, Calvinism, whatnot. Mm-hmm. And then let's have the students make up their mind for themselves
Right.
instead of shoving it down the throat of, you should believe this because we say so, and you want to fit into the group or not, you better believe kind of feel. And like this, just, I like this open-ended dialogue of, let's talk about whatever, and let's not even care. Let's not worry about if it's politically correct or not to talk about. And
Right.
that's really, I respect that a lot. And
Right. Yeah, we can't just avoid those. We can't just avoid discussions because they might be uncomfortable. We need to talk about these things. That's one of the reasons why people going off that. This is one of the reasons why I think we're losing a lot of people who have same-sex attractions to the LGBT community, because we're not talking about it in church. And when it is talked about in church, it's usually open acceptance. And I think there's very much so a need for a biblical sexual ethic to be spoken to people. And biblical sexual ethic is not just abstinence until marriage. If you just say you need to avoid sex until marriage, and that's the only thing your youth pastor ever says, that's not good enough. Need some reasons for that, need some reasons for all these other things. But a lot of people don't talk about it. And so these things need to be brought up because people are thinking these things. One of the major reasons for a lot of people leaving the church these days is, in fact, having to do with same-sex attractions and the way that some churches deal with same-sex attractions. So I think it's important to talk about these things and to have a solid ethic about it. If I can make another book recommendation, see if I can remember the name of it. I think it's called Chasing Love. It's by Sean McDowell. It's a red book. It's red cover, and I think it's got gold letters on it. I'm pretty sure it's called Chasing Love. It's definitely written for like high school students sort of thing, but it is, anybody can read it. If you're 50 years old, you can read it and get something out of it. And I think it does a very good job of going through and explaining biblical sexual ethics. Many facets.
Yeah, that's a discussion that's needed. It seems like today, like, you hear just exactly like you said, my youth pastor would say, don't have sex till you're married. And, Nate, my roommate, he's kind of tricky. And he was like, he raised his hand. And he's like, so how many of y'all waited till marriage to have sex? And like, I think it was like 10% of the youth pastors. There was like 7 or, there was probably 10 like leaders. One person waited. And it was like, interesting. So you're telling us to wait, and the Bible says to wait, God says to wait, but no one waited practically. And so it's like, that wasn't ever an argument that really worked for me.
Yeah.
Arguments that worked for me more might have been, the psychological reasons. You might blind yourself, the oxytocin.
Yep.
You're just going to let those insecurities of the other person just kind of fade away because you're just blinded and you're in love. And so it's like, that was like a better argument for me. But like, that's just a little rabbit hole of like, I think you're totally right. Like, there's got to be, sure, you can give the biblical reason. I'm totally down. But if you give other reasons to support, it just makes that biblical argument so much stronger. And that's, I feel like, what people my age need, or younger, where it's like, we live in a world where, science is a tool that really helps us live. But then if you walk into a building and they only use the Bible as the methodology and the reason, you're just going to get people leaving. And right. I think that's totally right.
Yeah. It's one of those things where we need to, if we stop at the Bible says, people are going to inevitably ask at some point. Inquisitive minds want to know, why does the Bible say? And why should I believe it? And why should I follow what, as some have put it, what a 4,000-year-old book written by ancient goat herders thought that I should do with my body? And how should we? Why should we do that? There's so much more to it. And if we just stop at, say, thou shalt not lie, and not ask, why shouldn't we lie? God says that for a reason. God doesn't say it just to say it. God says it because it's a reflection of his character and nature. God's character and nature is truth. God is. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the truth. So going against his character is a lie. A lie goes against his character. That's what makes it wrong. That it's listed in the Bible is not what makes it wrong. It's listed in the Bible because it's wrong, and God wants to let you know that. He's letting you know that that goes against his character, and don't do that. So it's things like that. And to be able to do that with things like biblical sexual ethics or anything along those lines having to do with ethical questions. They're important. And I don't think that's done enough. We give the rule and not the reason. And the rule without the reason is legalism. And people just have no reason to do it. And that's one of those questions is like, if all you've been given is a list of rules and a macaroni picture of David and Goliath that you made in Sunday school and said, there you go, have fun in college, take your macaroni picture, you're going to say, I don't know, my pieces of macaroni aren't even within the lines. I glued them way out here. So I don't know, why should I stay? One of the important things is to give people reasons to stay before they want to leave. And that's an important thing. And some of the surveys show people start having these questions in middle school. They really start ramping up the questions in high school. Some of them have made up their mind already before they even graduate high school that once they're gone, once they're out of the house, they're done. So if there's nobody to say, hey, get up, it's time to go to church, it's easy to just keep sleeping. So, and that apathy can turn into non-belief after a while, and just, again, if you don't have any good reason, then what's the point in continuing to follow it?
Yeah, that's well said, as always. And, I want to dive into church. And, what would you say are some good reasons why people should, as Christians or as people, go to a church or go to a community? Do you feel like a church is required to be a Christian? And, why?
I wouldn't say church is required to be a Christian, but it certainly helps in remaining a Christian. A church community is something that is there for the purposes of making certain that you have some sort of accountability in your life, and giving you a constant feeding of, say, input from God. There's the old story of the lake, that it was a dead lake. No fish were in it. Why is that the case? Well, you could have a dead lake. If you have water that is just stagnant and doesn't move, it's dead. It doesn't have any water flowing into it, and it doesn't have any water flowing out of it. It dies. It's sort of the same thing with people. They need a healthy influx of God, and they also need an outpouring, an outlet as well. And there's something that God has created each of us for, and that can be our way of worship. Having these sorts of conversations is, I think, a form for me. This is what I love to do. I love to have these types of conversations, and this is how I do the outflow part. But I also need the inflow part. I need people to help me as well. To tell me, teach me things about spiritual disciplines, or, it could be anything like that. It could be anything from eating habits to making sure that you take a day of rest so that you don't burn out. And so that's where the church comes in. It's a community of believers that are helping each other to get better. It's what's called progressive sanctification. It's the idea of growing closer to Christ. Now, that doesn't save you. You are saved by grace, and God will meet you anywhere you are in order to save you. But he doesn't want you to stay there. He wants you to grow toward him. So that's what it's all about, and that's what church greatly helps with. So I do think it's important. So Paul says, don't forsake the gathering of believers, or something along those lines. And maybe that wasn't even Paul, but that's somewhere in the New Testament. Something like that is somewhere in the New Testament. I just don't know exactly where.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's pretty good reasons. I wrote those down because, technically speaking, I'm a person who hasn't gone to church very much in the past few years. Maybe I could be considered a person who's a lower quality Christian because of that. I find a deeper value and sense of connection with God, if you want to say that, when I have conversations with, my roommate, his dad, the pastor, youth pastors, my counselor, my girlfriend, my family, my brother, my friends about this topic. And for some reason, when I walk into a church, I have this feeling of, oh man, I feel isolated because I feel like I'm a person with a lot of questions who hasn't even fully put my foot down on Jesus as a literal Messiah, or the resurrection is literal, or just I'm the kind of person who's I need to truly have have reasons before I just say things offhandedly. But I've just had these situations where I try to vulnerably explain my question or doubt, or maybe the devil's advocate to what someone might say, and typically it just doesn't end up very amazingly. And maybe that's because of the way I say it, or maybe it could be I could improve the way I say it possibly. But sometimes I feel like people are looking down on me as if I am a lost sheep, or oh, you'll find the truth soon enough. Don't you worry. I'm sure of it. You're just having a hard time right now. Or this kind of looking down on, disappointed, praying and hoping he finds the truth type vibe, if you want to say. And it turns me off, to be honest. And I'm trying to figure out what type of environment is the environment to unload / output these questions. And Ratio Christi could be a situation where I do that, or a philosophy group with Tim McGrew. I could join these things. Yeah. I just need to get on it. And one thing that I'm very curious asking you about is Andy Brown, my counselor. He has a similar feeling of me, of less interested in an organized church, but he created something called a house church, which you probably know about. And like, that's the kind of thing that like draws me in so magnetically versus walking into a building like a church. I have this like allergic reaction of like, it's just going to make me annoyed. And this is where I'm like, I can't tell if I'm, what's the right word? Someone like Jeff Winke might say I have spiritual scurvy. I'm not looking into the Bible enough. I'm not surrounding myself with Christians enough. And I might say, I think you might have the opposite of that. You surround yourself mainly with Christians and you read mainly the Bible or Christian authors. And like, I just don't know the balance of how much to look into, you know, Stoicism, Buddhism, other religions, and how much to focus on the Bible and where to go to ask these questions. And that was a bit of like a, just me explaining me,
Sure.
but that's kind of where I'm at the moment. And that's why talking with you, I knew would just be very interesting because, you know, I wanted to explain where I'm at and see what you thought.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying this. I think your experience is not uncommon. I think, as I can see in the background there, you have Jordan Peterson's book. And I think what he says in a number of different interviews, why are young men such as yourself so interested in what he has to say? There happens to be something in society, an aspect of society that is doing its best to, for lack of a better word, castrate men. And men are looking for purpose. They're looking for, there's that book from years ago called Wild at Heart, right? And it's a book about men being manly. Now, we're not talking like, you know, the, shotgunning a beer at the fraternity manliness and trying to sleep with as many ladies as possible sort of manliness. We're talking about men being legitimate men. And they're having a problem doing that in some cases. And William Lane Craig, who is one of the world's leading apologists, has said that one of the reasons he finds that people are drawn to apologetics, especially young men, is because the church is not geared primarily toward intellectual pursuits. This is sad. Listen, we have 2,000 years. We have 1,900 years of rich intellectual tradition. Some of the greatest philosophers in history, some of the greatest scientists in history have been believers, committed believers. Look at St. Thomas Aquinas. The guy was brilliant. Okay? One of the greatest philosophers of all time. He was a hardcore Christian, right? And this is something that we have lost. I don't know exactly why that's the case. If I were to make a guess, I would say it has a lot to do with the liberal German scholarship of the 1800s. And what happened in the 1800s in Germany was scholars influenced by the philosopher Hegel, and eventually going into what's called the Tübingen School of Theology, essentially had this idea of let's approach the Bible from a naturalistic point of view and say, how can we explain all this stuff in the Bible naturally? And start talking about the sort of mythological aspects of the Bible and start talking about all these different things. Okay. What happened was there was an early response to this, sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s, who are called the fundamentalists. Now, early fundamentalists were highly intellectual people putting forward intellectual arguments for what they call the fundamentals, which are, say, the virgin birth of Christ, the bodily resurrection of Christ, and, things like that. As far as I understand it, there was a major turn at the Scopes monkey trial, which was basically a person who was put on trial for teaching evolution in Tennessee. While technically the creationists won the court case, in popular opinion, and the movie Inherit the Wind sort of showed this in a much worse light. It was around this time, and maybe that had something to do with it, maybe there were other things that had to do with it, where fundamentalists especially started checking out of the intellectual discussions. Said, let's build bubbles instead. Hunker down and wait for Jesus to come back. Pray Jesus comes back soon, right? And what has happened is now there's almost not only is there a highly emotional aspect to churches, but in some cases there are anti-intellectual aspects to Christianity. And this is sad. One, because we are losing people because of this. Two, because God says we are supposed to use our intellect. God said, Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? He says, love the Lord your God. What part of it is to love the Lord your God with all your mind. Okay? At least, this is the greatest commandment. What Jesus, God, in the form of a man, he's here as a human. He says, what is the greatest commandment? And, what is it? 1/3 of it. It's love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, right? So 1/4 of that is to love the Lord your God with all your mind. What does that mean? Does that mean you shut your brain off when you go to church? No. God did not create your intellect so that you could walk into church and shut it off when you walk into church. Check your brain at the church door. That's not what God made it for. Unfortunately, a lot of churches today are geared toward the worship time, the music time, the lights, the loud music, the whatever it might be, the pizza parties and the video games at the youth group. And it's not about the discussions. What are we going to do? Are we going to have pizza? Would you rather have pizza or talk about same-sex attractions at youth group this week? Well, obviously we're going to all want pizza instead of talking about same-sex attractions, right? So that's what's done. People are not prepared. But the thing is that people have these questions, and especially young men such as yourself have these questions. And I think the church is missing the boat. Fortunately, there are people out there, like myself, like a number of other apologists out there, who are here to talk about these things, who are here to answer these questions, who are here to say, you have doubts? That's okay. Let's talk about them. That's what people need to hear. In fact, some surveys have showed just a willingness to sit there and say, what are your doubts? What are your questions? Is actually immensely helpful. Rather than saying, just trust Jesus, you're going to find out someday that doesn't matter, all of that stuff. So what I would say to you personally and to people like you is don't give up. Don't forsake the church. The church has its place. The church has its role. But also, there's other aspects of the church. There are people outside of your particular building that you might attend on a weekly basis who are still part of the church, who can edify and lift you up through discussions of these things. Okay, there are tons of things out there. William Lane Craig's podcasts. He's got one called Reasonable Faith, and he's got one called Defenders. If you want meat, the Defenders class, he's done it 3 times, and each time it gets a little more robust. So it goes over the same material in each one, but you can start with, say, 3. It's basically a philosophical, systematic theology going through all kinds of discussions about intellectual issues. The Unbelievable Show. It's a British radio show. It's unbelievable with a question mark at the end. And essentially, the host typically has, sometimes it's 2 Christians, but a lot of times it's a Christian and a non-Christian on there to have a discussion about some issue. And it can be really fascinating. Sometimes it gets a little crazy, but the host is a pretty good host, and he actually does pretty well with moderating those debates. So, and there's a whole number of things out there like this. I love Sean McDowell's YouTube channel. Great. I think he's got some really good stuff up there. So there's lots of resources. Plenty of places to go to ask these questions, to deal with these doubts. And where the church has dropped the ball, others are picking it up, sometime without notice, and we're carrying that ball, we're trying to carry that ball back into the church. But hey, we have actually found a number of people that you talk to who are apologists will find that it is difficult to try to get this stuff into churches, just because pastors are busy. Pastors got other stuff they need to talk about. They also don't know whether or not you're a heretic, and can we put this guy in front of a youth group and or is he gonna, spout heresy, those sorts of things. And do we really want to say the head of the department of the local secular university and ask him to come speak to our youth group? Do we actually want to do that? In your case, actually, I don't know if Tim is still the head of the department there, but either way, having Tim speak to your youth group would be an amazing thing. Now, I know that he's pretty busy, but those are the sorts of things that, and there are many people willing to do these sorts of things and have these sorts of conversations with people. So we're out there, and I would say make use of those resources.
Yeah, that's really good advice overall. I've kind of used YouTube like these different channels, like you're saying, different podcasts, different videos, different just people I really respect in their search. It's been really helpful. Mm-hmm. And a thing that Andy Brown says to me quite often is, it's like, well, the most important thing is that you continue the search. Like you're saying, the journey has to continue. It's not like, sure, you might be a little annoyed at the current situation of your church or some of the churches you've been to, but that doesn't like abstain you from the responsibility of like, you need to continue that search.
Right.
Because what you'll find, it's like knocking, the door will be opened. When you look, you will find. And so it's like, and I also really like what you said towards the beginning, where it's like, sometimes where you're searching might not always lead you right to like person who sits up right up front in church every Sunday. Maybe it might lead you away, but it might lead you back. But it's like your individual journey has to be, what's the right word? Individual in some sense, or it has to be genuine.
Yes.
Yeah, like
I would say I think every kid that grows up in the church comes to a point where they have to make their faith their own. They have to go from, this is what mom and dad say, but what do I say? And if they have nothing more to go on than mom and dad say so, and that macaroni glued to a David and Goliath picture, that's not going to be good enough. So we need to be prepared. We need to be ready to give an answer for those who ask us what our hope is in Jesus. We need to be able to do that. And many people are completely unprepared. Many people, if you ask them for one evidence for the truth of Christianity, they couldn't give it to you. And that is extremely sad, because there is a rich history of evidence. There is so much evidence out there. You want historical evidence for the resurrection? We've got interesting stuff there. We've got ideas about, the Bible reliability and all those sorts of things. So it's out there. The evidence is out there. YouTube channels, podcasts, books. I like to suggest people start with, I think Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace is actually a very good one. He's the homicide detective, or he's retired now, but he was a cold case homicide detective. Cold Case Christianity is great. The old classic, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. That's a good place to start for people. A little bit more on the higher, a little bit more technical end, but I don't think too technical for somebody who with a high school education, would be I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. And then higher up than that would be something like Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. Now, his podcast by that name is pretty digestible. But Reasonable Faith, the book, is a little bit more, at a little bit more of a higher level. So, but those are good places to start. There's also Hidden in Plain View, which is written by Tim's wife, Lydia. That is a very interesting argument. It's one of the arguments that that Tim unearthed in some of this older material from the 1800s called Undesigned Coincidences. And she ended up, Lydia ended up writing a whole book on this sort of thing. They're just basically incidental details that contact each other between the Gospels or between Paul's letters and the book of Acts. And there's just so much good evidence. I mean, just looking at the book of Acts, Luke was such a detailed historian, and he just nails some details over and over again. There's a book, it's probably a little out of the price range because it's a little bit difficult, or it's kind of hard to find sometimes, but it's a little bit expensive, but see if I can remember the name of it. It's like the the setting of the book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic something or other. It's by Colin Hamer. And, yeah, the name escapes me. But the chapter 4 of that book, he gives 80 different things that are just in the book of Acts that have been confirmed by archaeology or outside history that Luke gets exactly right. So, over and over again, he just nails it. And that's the thing. All these writers, they get small details right. And that's an important aspect to show that these are actually reliable texts. Over and over again, it's one of these things. So, for instance, there's a time when there's, I think this is when Paul is in Ephesus, and there is a huge crowd that's very angry, and the guy is sort of in charge, gets up in front of all the people and says, "Hey, look, we're in danger of, being said to start a riot here. We don't want to be saying anything like that. If y'all have a, by the way, y'all is a Greek word. There's a Greek word for y'all. So, but the idea is, if y'all have made have some problem here, there are proconsuls available that you can talk to sort of figure this out. Proconsuls. That shouldn't be. Did Luke make a mistake there writing proconsuls? There shouldn't be two proconsuls. There's only one proconsul for an area. You don't have two proconsuls. Interestingly, the first century Jewish historian Josephus actually says something very interesting here, and he says, I believe it was Josephus that has written about this. There's another text somewhere that written, and I'm pretty sure it's Josephus. But anyway, he says, this author says that basically the emperor, the Roman emperor, died by poisoning. And not too long after that, the proconsul in this area where these people were also died of poisoning. It seems that these two people were sort of in collaboration with those who helped to poison the emperor, and basically said, hey, if you help me, I'll help you. And so it's Nero's, I think Emperor Nero's mother, who's sort of orchestrating this, makes it the case that they helped her poison the emperor, and so she helps them become proconsuls. And we do have it recorded that for a period of time in that exact area, there are proconsuls available. There are two of them. Now, this is very interesting because Luke doesn't sit there and say, hey, by the way, there were proconsuls, two of them. This is a weird thing. You should go check it out. He doesn't say any of that. The person speaking just says, hey, there's proconsuls available if you want to talk to them. That's all that's really said. It's just a detail in passing that's not really made a big deal of at all. But it's something that can be verified that actually happened, that actually took place. So little details like that, over and over again, people get things about geography, things about coins of the day, all of those sorts of things that people just get right. In fact, anytime that you hear in the New Testament where somebody says, we're going down to Jerusalem, or we're going up to Jerusalem, or we're going down to Galilee, those are elevation changes. They're literally going up to Jerusalem. They're literally going down. Okay. So those are the sorts of things that are going on. Anytime they say they're going up or down, it's an elevation change. And so they just nail that stuff. And all those little details really show that these are eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Well, I guess like a final question or thought that I wrestle with a lot, which is like, okay, I'm just speaking third person. Harley, you grew up in a Christian household with great parents, great friends, great country to live in. Very amazing country to live in, opportunity-wise. You also happen to be blessed with the jackpot of the religion that happens to be correct. What if I was born in another area? Why am I the lucky jackpot lottery winner that happened to live in the best time place with the correct religion with great parents? Why is that the case when other people don't have that? And so it's like, it's so tough when I go to school with people who have lived on the other sides of the world, and then me trying to be so convicted that the religion I happen to be born into is the exact correct religion. That's one that just forever just is like, how can I be so lucky? But maybe I am.
Or blessed, either way.
Yeah, that's a better probably word for that, yeah.
I think, one of the things you said before, asking about the question of how much should I look into Buddhism and how much should I look into these other religions? One of the questions that I think we need to ask is, why look into those? A question that someone should have, or someone should ask themselves, is why are they looking into those? There is a idea of relativism that is rampant among college students, especially. Most of my students that I see come into my classroom at, not my Ratio Christi students, but most of my students in my normal classrooms, my essentially secular classrooms, think by default that relativism is true, that everyone has their own truth when it comes to morals or religion, and that everybody's gonna, everybody lives out their own truth. If we're looking into different religions because we're trying to create the best all-you-can-eat buffet version of spirituality that we can, sort of the relativism buffet. I like this from Buddhism. Also, Jesus said this, which was pretty cool. And, the Hindus, they got some interesting thing over here. I think that that's not the right way to do it. The question that you and your Muslim friend or your Hindu friend or any of that should be asking is, which religion is correct? And how do we know? I have had a number of conversations with Mormons. When you ask a Mormon why they believe in the Book of Mormon and why they believe the things they do, they say, I know that the Book of Mormon is true, and I know that Joseph Smith is a prophet. Why? Because I've read the Book of Mormon, and I prayed and I asked Holy Father to tell me whether or not it was true, and I felt what they call the burning in the bosom. I felt it inside. Now, I've talked with a number of them, and they challenged me to read the Book of Mormon and pray about it. So I said, well, you know what? I'm pretty certain this is not true, but you are telling me to do this, and authentically, I'll take that challenge. So I'm reading about it. I'm reading it, and I'm praying about it. And I come back to them the next week, and they say, what'd you get? I said, I got nothing. So they say, keep reading. I come back the next week, and I said, I felt God tell me that Joseph Smith is not a prophet and that the Book of Mormon is not true. And they said, well, you got to keep reading. I said, how much do I need to keep reading? At what point can I say that I've read enough to know that this isn't true? Essentially what it comes down to, and this is a question I ask Mormons, and this is a question that we should ask ourselves as well. I have a feeling that Joseph Smith is not a prophet and that the Book of Mormon is not true. They have a feeling that the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith is a prophet. Whose feeling is the right feeling? A friend who's Muslim, who has a feeling that no one could write a book as beautiful as the Quran except for Allah. Why is his feeling any better than your feeling? What it comes down to, the way we, the word of the day, adjudicate between those two or three options, the way we figure out which one is true, is not by comparing our feelings. Because I don't know your feeling, you don't know my feeling. We need to look at the evidence. Now, is it the case that if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would likely be a Muslim? Yes. Actually, that's the case. However, if you're the type of person that says, let me investigate, let me ask these questions, like you're doing with Christianity, if you were to do the same thing with Islam, you may end up not being a Muslim and end up being a Christian. So, interesting story by Nabil Qureshi. It's called, the book is called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. He had a number of conversations with a guy by the name of David Wood, who has his own very interesting story. He's literally a psychopath. But he's a Christian. And he became a Christian in jail after literally trying to murder his dad. So his story is really interesting. He's got a half-hour video. I don't know if his YouTube channel is still up. He was saying he was going to shut it down or something like that. But at any rate, I forgot where I was going with all this. But the idea here is that we can't just go on our feelings. And we need to look at the evidence. And is it the case that you just happen to believe the right religion? I think that's the case. I do think it is the case that you just happen to believe the right religion. But I don't think that just happening to believe is a place you should stay in. I think it's a place that you do need to find your faith yourself. What I mean by that is you need to figure out what you believe. And that may be slightly different from what your parents believe. But the thing is, I have confidence that if you're seeking the truth, that you're seeking answers, and you have good resources for answers, that you'll find the same thing that I did, which is that Christianity is true and that there's great reason to believe that. And I don't think that Mormons or Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists can say anything like that.
That was pretty well said. Yeah, I hope you're right. You know what I mean? I got to keep looking,
Yeah.
and I might determine
you do.
that, but that's kind of the beauty. It's like, I'm excited to keep learning, and, you gave me like 25 resources probably.
I can give you 25 more
tons.
if you need them. So
No, yeah, but this is a great place to start, and then maybe end this pod because, well, you've kind of opened up my mind to the idea that, well, what you feel isn't enough in some cases. Like, it hasn't been enough for me. Like, maybe my mom feels this way about, the Holy Spirit. That doesn't convince me of anything. What convinces me should be evidence from, like you said, high quality sources that are trying to do their best to find the truth and promote the truth. And I'm optimistic that I will find my own view. Like, I'll find my faith. Everyone's faith is individual. I might use different books than you used. I might, etc. But, I also think that Christianity is a great model to raise children in. And that's something I'm going to have to figure out in the next probably 10 years, 5 years, something like that. I can see myself in the future finding these answers satisfying enough. In this current moment, it has been honestly somewhat interesting not being satisfied and searching for more. But I could definitely see myself reaching a point of like, all right, the hard questions, those are pretty much set in stone for me, and I can stand on them and act on them. And the nitty gritties, I'm still down to discuss, but I feel a peace that and that's like the goal. And I could see how that could just be such a great, journey and destination for me and for a lot of people maybe listening. So
I think I would say one thing about that is to not, to understand, I've been doing this for years. I still have questions. Okay. But like you said, I have the core stuff down. Like there's really good reason for me to trust the Bible. There's really good reason for me to believe that Jesus not only died, but also came back to life 3 days later in bodily form. Once I have those sorts of things down, these other things are periphery issues. And I would caution people against what I might call fence sitting. There's a point at which you have to make a decision. Because if you say, I'm going to wait till I have all my questions answered to be able to make a commitment, it's never going to happen. So, yeah, I'd say just keep that sort of thing in mind. But, yeah, and it's not just... Christianity is great to raise kids in. And it is practically a good thing. But that doesn't make it the right thing, because someone could just as easily say that Mormonism is a great way to raise kids. The question is it true? Is it really true? Did this actually happen? Did Jesus actually rise from the dead? That makes all the difference. Paul says, if he didn't, then we're to be pitied above all others, because we're walking around believing nonsense, something that's not true. But if it's true, it changes everything. The question is it true?
Guess we'll find out.
Sure. Hey, if you want to have me on again some other time to talk about evidence for the resurrection, or, dig into some of the evidences for the reliability of the Bible, I'd be glad to do that.
I'd be glad to do that for sure.
Okay, well,
yeah,
let's do that sometime.
We'll schedule it out. Yeah. I really appreciate you, John. You remind me of like a father figure / an older brother / a wise counsel I could go to. And so like, I really appreciate that. And it like, I can feel inside of like, man, this was meaningful and necessary. And I grew a lot, whether that be spiritually, mentally, etc. And I'm pleased to have met you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just really want to say
no
thanks.
problem, man. That's what I was put on this earth for. I really believe that. So, the more I can help, and the more I can help your listeners, that sort of thing, I'm excited to do it.
Well, I appreciate it.